It's Veritas Forum with Dr. Craig Johnson, Professor in Residence of Chalcedon Christian Academy and Pastor of Bethel Christian Fellowship in Agora Hills.
Welcome to Veritas Forum. My name is Craig Johnson. My guest is James Patrick Holding, author of Shattering the Christ Myth, and he is president of Tecton Apologetics. Welcome, JP.
Thank you, Craig.
I want to get a little bit of background information on you for our viewers. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm from the great state of Florida, actually one of the last people who was born a native there. And my background is I have a bachelor's degree in English and I have a master's degree in library science from Florida State University. I would much rather have gone to the University of Florida, but I had to go with the Seminoles. I didn't really want to.
Well, you are a researcher. You are an author. You've written Shattering the Christ Myth. You've written The Impossible Faith, The Mormon Defenders, Blowing the Doors Off. You've got a lot of other books in the pipeline. You're a researcher primarily. Tell us a little bit about critical use of sources. In this program, I want to talk about Wikipedia. I want to talk about the fact that in our information age, all you've got to do is go to Google and everyone's an instant expert, it appears. How do we evaluate sources and materials just for general study, let alone religious study?
Precisely. Let's mention that this is a very difficult problem precisely because of what you said. There is very little critical use of sources these days by many people. It is simply believed, used to be, if it's on television, it must be true. Now that's shifted to, if it's on the internet, it must be true. And there's many reasons for this. Some people simply don't want to go to all the trouble of looking something up. Other people, there's perhaps some pride involved. They feel that, well, I know best. I can evaluate this source critically for myself. I can make my own decision. I don't need this egghead with the PhD telling me what to do. And so we have so many people like producing things in print and on the internet who don't know what they're talking about. And then in turn we have people accepting it because they don't have the expertise to judge the credibility of the source that they're reading or that they've picked up off the internet. And this is a serious, serious problem today.
So give us some guidelines in choosing to view an article. Let's say there are a lot of articles of Christ mythers, people who are denying the historical existence of Jesus. And if you bring them up on Google, there's just tons of websites on this subject. And people are writing 30-page articles, all footnoted. And what are some, how can we develop our critical skills?
Certainly. Well, I've put together some guidelines, and I should point out that these are based on my experience as a person who knows library science. These are the same kind of criteria that professional researchers will use in evaluating a source. So this is not something that I'm simply making up. And you don't have to just give up and say, I'll just pick the source I like best. You can do some of this legwork, and it isn't that difficult. And there are some basic research guidelines. I'm going to go over these one at a time and explain exactly how they apply to any particular book that you might pick up or any particular internet resource. Because you're right, you see a source and it may use a lot of footnotes, and you may think simply because it does that it's particularly imposing. But if you just take a little closer look, you can find out some things that will tell you whether or not a source is to be trusted. Now, I should point out as well, these guidelines I'm going to give you are not 100% ironclad absolutes. There are always potential exceptions, but you can at least start with a critical eye and eliminate some of the dross, right, so that you can come to the gold and at least find that more quickly. Okay? So let's go ahead and talk about some of these things that I look at personally as a researcher when I'm evaluating any given source. And mind you, this is whether it's a Christian source, this is whether it's a source by a pagan, it's whether it's a source by an atheist. They should all get the same treatment, okay? All right, the first guideline is the most basic and the most obvious, and that is check their credentials, right? And what am I talking about when I say credentials? What I'm talking about is, have they received a proper education in the field that they are writing to? I like to use this example when I talk to youth. You know, if you're getting sick to your stomach right now, you don't go to the phone book and call Tire Kingdom, do you? Mm-hmm. Right? You don't call up the tire store. Who do you call when you're feeling sick? You call a doctor. And why would you call a doctor rather than the guy at Tire Kingdom? Well, because hopefully the doctor went to medical school, he had all that training, he had all that education, he knows his business, right? In everyday life, we will naturally gravitate towards someone who knows their business when we have some kind of problem. If some of these people who accept anything and everything off of Wikipedia or what have you were consistent, they would go out to Tire Kingdom to get their bad stomach taken care of. Because everyone's opinion is as good as anyone else's, right? Well, if you really believe that, then you won't see a doctor first thing off when you're sick. You will just see anyone out there. So what you have to look for, and thankfully most books will have something like this, you will look on the book itself or whatever source it is or on the web page, and you will try to find out what credentials these people have, what kind of degrees they have, what kind of schooling they have, whether they've published in the field previously or done something similar. And here's what you have to look out for. If you go to a book and you see that there are no credentials listed, you go there and you see that they're not relevant credentials, and this is something especially that applies to the Christ myth. You know, one of the leading Christ myth books for a while was written by a guy who was a kidney doctor. He's obviously not a historian. He's an expert in some other field. Or if it says that they have a PhD from Vanderbilt or whatever, but it doesn't say what it's in, then some caution is warranted about that source. Because if they don't have the credentials, then it's possible that they have come into the field not knowing what they're talking about and do not have the discipline to recognize what is good in that field they're discussing. Now, there's a certain caveat involved in that too. Okay, that doesn't mean that someone like that can't write a book that is very good on these subjects. But if that's the case, if they don't have the credentials, then you might need to look at the sources they use to make their case and see what their credentials are. So in other words, you may not have to be a doctor to write a book on medicine, but at the very least, your book should be filled with footnotes to medical sources, to medical doctors, to nurses, to whoever knows the business well.
So are they credentialed, and also are they credentialed in that field? Because they could have a PhD in trampoline and they're making pronouncements on nuclear physics. So we need to watch closely. But again, C.S. Lewis was not credentialed in a way that often people had a great respect for him during his day. So how do we guard against intellectual snobbery? Even people have said that you're not credentialed to be writing on certain issues, critics of your website and so on. How do we balance that?
That's where you do have to look at the sources they use and have to compare them to the sources that have the credentials and see if that's what they're using. You know, Lewis was very careful not to step outside his field. He was an expert in literature, and most of the commentary he made had to do with the literature of the Bible. But he also got into philosophical arguments, and for that, you know, he relied very much on common sense and upon his own thought. There are some things he said that he probably shouldn't have. If he had known some of the scholarship we're familiar with now, he probably would not have said some of those things. But this is why it's not enough to simply pick up one source and decide you're done. Okay? These issues are very complex. And so if you're going to be a critic, you know, if you're going to just understand the Bible simply, that's one thing. But if you're going to be a critic of the Bible and try and tear it apart, or if you want to be a disciple and understand it better, you must get deeper into the sources and the source material.
So credentials first.
Credentials are the first
thing. And then
thing.
sources. Now, how would one check their sources in a book or a journal article?
The best thing to do when checking a source to see whether it is a reputable one is to go towards the back matter in a book or at the end of a magazine article or at the end of an internet article. You need to look at the sources and see whether there are any to begin with. I can't tell you how many times I've dealt with people who referred me to some internet article or some book, and I turn it to look for footnotes or endnotes, and there are none. Or there's maybe 5 in a book that's this big, and it's usually to the Bible or something like that. It's just a reference to something inside the Bible or inside some text. If this person is not doing any serious research, if they're just sitting down, typing away, giving their own opinion, that's not going to be worthwhile. I'm not saying that there aren't some scholars who can do stuff like that, but some people who have done that, who have become scholars, have earned the right to be able to just sit down and type freely from what they remember and from what they have studied. If this person who has created this source is not a scholar in the field, then they need to be heavily footnoting their claims. They need to be documenting what they say. All right. Now, again, because some people have been scholars, they can get away with not documenting certain things because it's taken for granted in their own field. They don't have to document some things that are a given in their own field. But if you are writing to an everyday person, you had better make sure that you document the things that you say.